A nation smaller than many modern cities forced one of the world's largest military superpowers into absolute humiliation. On paper, this war should have lasted less than 2 weeks. In the winter of 1939, a massive mechanized invasion force poured across the border, equipped with thousands of tanks, limitless artillery, and overwhelming air superiority. The invading generals had pre-planned their victory parties. Their leader, Joseph Stalin, believed the campaign would be a swift, triumphant parade. Instead, his army walked into one of history's most embarrassing military disasters. Over 105 days of brutal, subarctic combat, an army of farmers, lumberjacks, and reservists systematically dissected the Goliath that invaded them. By the time the guns fell silent, the snow was stained with the blood of over 126,000 dead and missing Soviet soldiers. How did this happen? How did a radically outnumbered, under-equipped nation without a modern tank force completely paralyze a mechanized juggernaut? Was it simply a matter of the cold? Or did a revolutionary tactical doctrine, combined with catastrophic leadership failures on the other side, turn the frozen forests into a perfect killing ground? To understand why the Red Army suffered such catastrophic localized losses, and what lessons this conflict permanently burned into modern military doctrine, we have to look past the legends. We have to examine the anatomy of the Winter War. To understand the slaughter in the snow, we first have to understand the paranoia in Moscow. In August 1939, the geopolitical landscape of Europe shifted seismically with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Outwardly a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, its secret protocols effectively partitioned Eastern Europe into distinct spheres of influence. Finland was handed over to the Soviet sphere. Stalin harbored an obsessive strategic paranoia regarding the security of Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second-largest city and a vital industrial hub. The Finnish border on the Karelian Isthmus lay a mere 32 kilometers, about 20 miles, from Leningrad's northern suburbs. It was well within the potential range of hostile heavy artillery. Stalin feared that a neutral Finland could be used as a staging ground by foreign powers like Germany to strike directly at the heart of the Soviet state. In October 1939, Soviet diplomats presented severe demands to Helsinki: sea-day the Karelian Isthmus, push the border 60 kilometers back, lease the Hanko Peninsula for a naval base, and surrender strategic islands in the Gulf of Finland. Finland, having watched the Soviet Union recently bully the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into similar mutual assistance pacts that led to military occupation, refused to surrender its primary defensive lines. Stalin needed a reason to attack, so he manufactured one. On November 26, 1939, at the Russian border village of Mainila, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, staged a false flag operation. They shelled their own village and blamed it on Finnish artillery. Using this fabricated incident to justify war, the Soviet Union unilaterally severed diplomatic relations. 4 days later, on November 30th, the invasion began. The Red Army didn't just cross the border, they unleashed a multi-front cataclysm. The plan was to strike across the entire 800-mile frontier simultaneously. The Soviet 7th Army would smash the main Finnish defenses on the Karelian Isthmus. The 8th Army would outflank them north of Lake Ladoga. The 9th Army would drive through the center of the country to the Gulf of Bothnia, slicing Finland in half, while the 14th Army secured the Arctic North. Soviet bombers appeared in the skies over Helsinki, raining explosives on civilian targets. The world watched in horror. The League of Nations expelled the Soviet Union. But diplomatic protests don't stop tanks. The military imbalance was staggering. It remains one of the most pronounced quantitative disparities in modern warfare. The Soviet Union mobilized an initial invasion force of over 450,000 troops, quickly scaling to nearly 1 million. They brought between 2,000 and 6,000 tanks, over 3,000 combat aircraft, and a virtually unlimited supply of heavy artillery and ammunition. Against this, the Republic of Finland fielded a mobilized defense force of roughly 250,000 to 340,000 men. They possessed fewer than 100 modern aircraft and a grand total of exactly 32 obsolete tanks. They had almost no dedicated anti-tank weaponry. Their artillery ammunition reserves were so low they were counted in days, not months. Soviet Defense Commissar Klement Voroshilov expected victory in weeks. He planned to hand Stalin a conquered Finland as a present for his 60th birthday on December 21st. But beneath the steel and the swagger, the Red Army was deeply, structurally hollow. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin had executed the Great Purge, liquidating tens of thousands of his own military officers. The brilliant military minds who had designed the Soviet deep battle doctrine were dead. In their place were politically reliable, deeply terrified loyalists. Tactical initiative was forbidden. Deviating from a rigid operational order without the approval of a political commissar was treason. Furthermore, the Red Army was trained and equipped for a conventional, mechanized war on the open plains of Central Europe. They were fundamentally blind to the environmental nightmare they were about to enter. When the Soviet 9th and 8th armies pushed into central and northern Finland, they encountered a landscape that defied mechanization. There were no open fields. There were only primeval pine forests, unmapped swamps, frozen lakes, and a few rudimentary logging roads. Because the snow was often over a meter deep, the heavy Soviet tanks, artillery tractors, and supply trucks could not deploy off-road. They were completely road-bound, forced into single-file columns that stretched for dozens of miles. To destroy these massive columns, the Finns utilized a genius doctrine born from their environment. They called it the Motti tactic. Throughout December 1939 and January 1940, in the dense wilderness of central and northern Finland, Finnish ski troops used the impassable forests to surround, chop up, and isolate massive Soviet columns into small pockets, starving them out before destroying them. The result was absolute. Entire Soviet mechanized divisions were completely wiped off the map by forces a fraction of their size. Let's break down exactly how a Motti operation worked. The word Motti comes from Finnish forestry. It refers to a measured bundle of felled timber pegged out in the woods to be chopped into firewood. Militarily, it was executed in 3 methodical phases. Phase 1 was to locate and fix. Finnish troops were universally equipped with cross-country skis, giving them total tactical mobility over the deep snow. Dressed in white camouflage bedsheets, they were virtually invisible. They would shadow the miles-long Soviet column from the deep woods. Racing ahead, Finnish combat engineers would fell massive trees across the narrow road and heavily mine the obstacle. When the lead Soviet tanks halted to clear the debris, the entire miles-long column behind them was forced to stop. Phase 2 was to isolate and segment. Once the column was stalled, highly independent Finnish ski squads attacked the flanks, usually at night. Operating in temperatures plunging to minus 40 degrees Celsius, they struck the road at specific intervals, destroying bridges and vehicles to physically chop the long formation into multiple isolated pockets, or Mottis. The Soviet troops, terrified of the dense mined forests, refused to leave the road. Phase 3 was to annihilate in detail. The Finns didn't rush in. They let the environment do the killing. Deprived of resupply, the isolated Soviet pockets quickly ran out of fuel and food. Finnish snipers prioritized high-value targets: commanders, political commissars, and field kitchens. Without hot food or fires, which immediately drew mortar fire, the trapped soldiers began to freeze to death. The Finns would systematically reduce the weakest Mottis first, utilizing rapid close-quarters assaults with hand grenades, satchel charges, and their signature weapon, the Suomi submachine gun. Facing thousands of Soviet tanks without anti-tank guns, the Finns also perfected a cheap, devastating weapon, a glass bottle filled with ethanol, tar, and gasoline. They named it after the Soviet foreign minister. They called it the Molotov cocktail. Thrown against the engine air intakes of a tank, it incinerated the vehicle from the inside out. The Motti was not just a physical trap, it was an engine of psychological terror. The most pristine, horrifying example of the Motti tactic occurred at the Battle of Suomussalmi and the Raate Road. The strategic Soviet objective was to slice Finland in half by driving to the Gulf of Bothnia. The Soviet 163rd Rifle Division captured the village of Suomussalmi, but was rapidly surrounded by Finnish reservists commanded by Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo. To relieve the trapped 163rd, the Soviet High Command dispatched the elite 44th Ukrainian Motorized Rifle Division down the narrow, freezing Raate Road. Between December 7, 1939 and January 8, 1940, Colonel Siilasvuo shifted his forces to intercept the relief column. Executing textbook Motti tactics, he cut the 20-mile-long 44th Division into pieces. The result was annihilation. The Finns captured massive stockpiles of Soviet equipment, and over 22,000 Soviet soldiers were killed across both divisions. The destruction on the Raate Road shocked the world. Colonel Siilasvuo had demonstrated a ruthless, calculated brilliance. Leaving a small holding force around the 163rd in the village, he focused the bulk of his combat power entirely on the advancing 44th Division. A critical, unseen factor aided the Finns: signals intelligence. Finnish cryptographers had broken the Soviet radio codes. Because Soviet units often broadcast in clear text or simple ciphers, Finnish intelligence provided Siilasvuo with a real-time, God's-eye view of the enemy's exact movements, their extreme supply shortages, and their desperate pleas for help. Armed with this knowledge, Finnish ski troops struck the Raate Road with surgical precision. When foreign journalists finally arrived at the scene, they found a frozen graveyard. Thousands of Soviet soldiers, lacking proper winter clothing, had frozen solid in the exact positions in which they died. Many were clutching stomach wounds, reaching for rifles, or huddled around extinguished fires. It looked like a macabre wax museum. The Finns suffered roughly 2,700 casualties. In return, they captured 43 tanks, 70 field guns, and thousands of rifles. The Soviet commander survived the massacre and managed to escape back to Soviet lines. For his failure, he was promptly court-martialed and executed by the NKVD. How did the Finnish soldier endure this? The answer lies in their doctrine of mission command. In the Finnish army, junior officers and non-commissioned officers were trusted to make dynamic, independent decisions on the battlefield. If a radio failed, a squad leader knew the objective and was empowered to achieve it using his own initiative. Furthermore, they received vital international support. While remaining officially non-belligerent, Sweden secretly supplied Finland with 131,000 rifles, anti-tank guns, and artillery. More importantly, over 8,200 Swedish volunteers formed the Swedish Volunteer Corps, taking over front-line duties in the north and freeing up Finnish divisions for the desperate fighting further south. And on the battlefield, local knowledge turned the bizarre into the decisive. Take the Battle of Tolvajärvi, an engagement that featured an event known as the Sausage War. On the night of December 10th, a flanking Soviet regiment overran a Finnish camp, but instead of pushing forward, they broke combat discipline to eat the freshly cooked sausage soup left behind. The Soviet regiment had marched for 5 days through the freezing wilderness. They were starving and exhausted, and the aroma of hot sausage soup was too much. The hungry men dropped their weapons to eat. This critical lapse gave the Finnish commander time to cobble together a scratch force of 100 cooks, medics, and clerks. In the pitch black, the Finns launched a ferocious hand-to-hand bayonet charge. Over 100 Soviet soldiers died in the snow, many with sausages still stuffed in their uniform pockets. Tolvajärvi became Finland's first major offensive victory, halting the Soviet Eighth Army and permanently boosting national morale. While the northern forests saw battles of mobility, the Kola River line became a meat grinder of attrition. Here, the Finnish 12th Division faced off against an estimated 160,000 Soviet troops, backed by relentless artillery. At Kola, the Finnish defense came close to collapse multiple times, yet they systematically counterattacked to restore the line. The battle produced the national motto, Kola holds. At the center of this maelstrom was Captain Arne Juutilainen, a man known to his troops and to history as the Terror of Morocco. Using his brutal combat experience from the French Foreign Legion, he orchestrated a fanatical defense against impossible odds. He prevented a catastrophic breakthrough that would have outflanked the entire Mannerheim Line. Juutalainen was an aggressive, fearless leader. When a major general visited the shattered front lines and asked if Kolla would hold, Juutalainen looked at him and replied, "Kolla will hold unless the orders are to run away." In one localized engagement known as Killer Hill, 32 Finns fought off an assault by 4,000 Soviet soldiers. When the smoke cleared, over 400 Soviets lay dead. Only 4 Finns survived. But the most famous figure to emerge from the Kolla front wasn't an officer. He was a 5'3" farmer who preferred to work alone. His name was Simo Häyhä. The Soviets called him the White Death. Operating alone in temperatures of -40 degrees, he achieved the highest number of confirmed sniper kills in any major war. He secured between 505 and 542 confirmed kills in under 100 days, paralyzing Soviet morale in his sector. Häyhä's fieldcraft bordered on the extreme. He refused to use a telescopic scope on his Mosin Nagant rifle. A scope's glass could catch the glare of the winter sun and give away his position. Furthermore, using a scope forces a sniper to raise their head an extra inch off the ground, an inch Häyhä was unwilling to risk. He relied entirely on iron sights. To remain invisible, he dressed in pure white. He poured water on the snowpack in front of his rifle barrel, freezing it solid so the muzzle blast wouldn't kick up a telltale puff of powder. He continuously chewed on snow to cool his mouth, preventing his warm breath from vaporizing in the freezing air. For nearly 100 days, Häyhä was a ghost, racking up over 500 confirmed kills with his rifle and nearly 200 more with his submachine gun. But on March 6, 1940, his luck ran out. During a renewed Soviet offensive, an exploding bullet struck Häyhä in the jaw, ripping his lower face apart. Dragged from the battlefield by his comrades, he slipped into a deep coma. The dramatic asymmetry of the Winter War spawned numerous legends. It's easy to look at the kill ratios and conclude that the Red Army was utterly incompetent, relying exclusively on mindless human wave attacks, while the Finns fought flawlessly. But history is rarely that simple. There is a claim that Motti tactics alone defeated the Soviet invasions. The reality is that this is unsupported. Motti tactics were devastating in the dense forests of the north, but the decisive strategic center of the war was the Karelian Isthmus. Here, the terrain was more open, and the war was defined by brutal, static trench warfare along the Finnish fortifications known as the Mannerheim Line. What about the claim that the Red Army was utterly incompetent? That is only partially true. Under the command of Kliment Voroshilov in December 1939, it was a disaster of rigid command and poor logistics. But the popular narrative ignores what happened next. The Red Army learned. Between January and February 1940, Stalin replaced Voroshilov with Marshal Semyon Timoshenko. Timoshenko halted the offensives, retrained the army, and unleashed a massive, coordinated combined arms assault. The result was that the Red Army shattered the Mannerheim Line, overwhelming the exhausted Finnish defenders. Timoshenko was a pragmatist. Recognizing the structural failures of the initial invasion, he completely reorganized Soviet strategy. He pulled his infantry and armor back. He built full-scale mock-ups of the Finnish concrete bunkers in the rear, forcing his troops to rehearse coordinated assaults over and over. He ensured proper winter lubricants were distributed so weapons wouldn't freeze. Most importantly, he abandoned the dispersed attacks across the wilderness and concentrated overwhelming firepower on a 16-kilometer stretch of the Mannerheim Line. On February 1, 1940, the storm broke. Over a 10-day period, nearly 2,800 Soviet artillery pieces unleashed 300,000 shells, literally pulverizing the reinforced concrete of the Finnish strongpoints. When the infantry attacked on February 11th, they didn't charge blindly. Tanks, infantry, and direct-fire artillery operated in unison. Desperate, the Finns attempted to use their own armor. At the Battle of Hankaniemi on February 26, the Finns deployed 8 light tanks in a rare counterattack to disrupt the Soviet advance. But the engagement unfolded in open terrain. The obsolete Finnish tanks, armed with 37mm guns, were outranged and outgunned by Soviet tanks. All 8 Finnish tanks were knocked out or disabled. The absolute material weight of the Soviet military was finally being applied correctly. The Finnish defenders, fighting without sleep, lacking the manpower to rotate troops, and critically short on artillery ammunition, simply could not plug the holes. The Mannerheim Line cracked. Knowing their army was on the verge of collapse, the Finnish government desperately sued for peace. On March 13, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed, silencing the guns. In a poetic twist of fate, the sniper Simo Häyhä awoke from his coma on the exact day the war ended. Finland was forced to cede roughly 11% of its pre-war territory, including the strategically vital Karelian Isthmus and its second-largest city, Viipuri. They had lost the operational war, but they had achieved the impossible. They preserved their sovereignty. Unlike the Baltic states, Finland was not annexed. It was not absorbed into the Soviet puppet system. They had made the cost of conquest so astronomically high that Stalin chose to settle rather than risk dragging the Western Allies into the fight. But the legacy of the Winter War extended far beyond the borders of Scandinavia. It cast a massive, deceptive shadow over the rest of the Second World War. Observing the spectacular disasters of the Raate Road and the initial resilience of the Finns, the German High Command evaluated the Soviet military as a hollow, incompetent force. Adolf Hitler famously concluded that one only needed to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. This fatal miscalculation gave Hitler the confidence to launch Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. What German intelligence failed to recognize was the steep learning curve the Red Army had demonstrated in February 1940. They didn't see Timoshenko's ruthless adaptations. They didn't realize that the Soviet Union, humiliated in the snows of Finland, had already begun a massive, desperate modernization of its military apparatus. The Winter War was a 105-day masterclass in asymmetric warfare. It proved that terrain, extreme weather, decentralized command, and unyielding morale could act as ultimate force multipliers. It demonstrated the lethal folly of deploying road-bound mechanized armies into restrictive environments. But above all, it remains a testament to the brutal mathematics of survival. Stalin got his buffer zone, but Finland kept its soul. If this deep dive into the Winter War changed how you understand World War II, hit that like button to tell the algorithm to share it with more history fans. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming documentaries. Let us know in the comments, what was the biggest mistake the Red Army made, and what battle should we cover next? Thanks for watching.